There is a child standing in a corner of a house you have never visited, and yet you know exactly what that corner looks like. You know the wallpaper. You know the particular silence that falls over a room when a family has decided, without ever voting on it, without ever saying it aloud, that one small person will carry what none of the adults are willing to carry themselves. You know this because some of you were that child, and some of you have spent 40, 50, 60 years walking around in a grown body, wearing a grown face, running a business, raising children of your own, and somewhere underneath all of it, that child is still standing in that corner, waiting to be told it wasn't their fault. I want to speak to that child tonight, not to the resume you have built, not to the reputation you have polished, to the one who was blamed for the weather in the house, the one who absorbed the tension nobody else would name, the one who became, without consent, without understanding, the place where the family's pain went to be stored. Because here is the thing nobody told you in that corner, and nobody may have told you since. The very sensitivity that made you useful as a scapegoat is the same instrument, unmodified, unbroken, that can make you a seer. The wound and the gift arrived in the same delivery. You have simply spent your life mistaking one for the other. So let us begin there, in the corner, and let us walk together all the way to the other side of it. Every family, every tribe, every small society of human beings carries a shadow. This is not a metaphor I offer lightly. I mean it structurally, the way an architect means a load-bearing wall. A shadow is everything the group cannot look at directly, the grief nobody processed, the rage nobody was allowed to feel, the shame passed down like a family heirloom nobody remembers unwrapping. And a shadow, if it is not carried consciously by those who created it, does not simply evaporate. It looks for a place to land. It looks for the softest, most permeable surface in the room. And who is the softest, most permeable surface in any family? It is almost never the loudest child. It is almost never the one who fights back, who slams doors, who makes noise proportional to the disturbance around them. It is the quiet one, the watchful one, the one who, before the age of 5, had already learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather, the tightening of a jaw, the extra beat of silence before an answer, the particular quality of a parent's footsteps on the stairs. That child was not weak. That child was gifted with an almost unbearable perceptiveness, and the family, unconsciously, not out of malice, but out of its own blindness, found the most sensitive instrument in the house and used it as a drain. This is the mechanism of the scapegoat. It is ancient. It is older than any single family. It is stitched into the earliest religious rites of the human species, where a village would take an animal, lay its collective guilt symbolically upon its back, and drive it out into the wilderness so the village itself might feel clean again. The ritual was abandoned, the theology mostly forgotten, but the psychological pattern never left us. It simply moved indoors. It moved into kitchens and living rooms. And in many families, it did not choose a goat, it chose a child. If this is your story, I want you to hear something clearly, because it may be the first time anyone has said it to you without qualification. What happened to you was not a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of the family's inability to hold its own darkness. You were not blamed because you were bad. You were blamed because you were available and because you were made of material fine enough to absorb what heavier, coarser instruments in that house could not. And here is where the story usually goes wrong, where it curdles into something that keeps a person small for decades. The child, not yet possessing the conceptual tools to understand any of this, because what child has the words for unconscious projection or generational shadow does the only thing available to a child's mind. It makes meaning out of chaos, because meaning, even false meaning, is more bearable than randomness, and the meaning it makes is almost always the same. I must be the problem. If I am the one being blamed over and over in ways too consistent to be coincidence, then there must be something wrong with me at the root. This conclusion is false, but it is also, tragically, one of the most durable beliefs a human psyche can construct, because it was built in childhood before the architecture of doubt existed to test it. A belief formed that early does not live in the same part of the mind as your adult opinions. It lives lower, older, closer to the body. You can argue with it intellectually for years, and it will nod politely and remain exactly where it was, because it was never an argument to begin with. It was a survival strategy disguised as a fact. So the child grows. And because the world outside the family often behaves according to the same blind mechanics as the world inside it, this pattern tends to repeat. The overly sensitive child becomes the overly accommodating student, the peacekeeping sibling, the friend who absorbs everyone's crisis, the partner who apologizes first, even when the fault was never theirs. A role was assigned in a house with wallpaper you knew before you ever entered it, and that role, unless it is consciously interrupted, will follow you like a shadow follows a body, which is, of course, precisely what it is. I want to pause here and say something that may sound strange coming from someone urging you toward transformation. I am not going to tell you that the wound was secretly a gift all along, delivered with hidden good intentions, some cosmic lesson wrapped in suffering, like a present in ugly paper. That is a comfort many people reach for, and I understand the reach, but it is not quite true, and I think you deserve more than a comforting half-truth tonight. The wound was not a gift. The wound was a wound. It hurt because it was designed by the blind mechanics of an unconscious family system to hurt. Nobody should have to carry what you carried at the age you carried it. But, and this is the turn, this is the hinge on which the entire architecture of this evening rests. What you do with a wound after it has been inflicted is not predetermined by the wound itself. The same raw material, the same unbearable sensitivity to the emotional undercurrents of a room, can either calcify into a permanent identity of victimhood, in which you remain forever the one things happen to, or it can be metabolized, slowly, deliberately, often painfully, into a capacity that very few people on this earth ever develop, the capacity to perceive what others cannot even name in themselves. This is not poetry. This is not a motivational trick to make suffering feel purposeful in retrospect. This is a description of an actual psychological process that has been observed across cultures, across centuries, in myth after myth, long before anyone had the language of psychology at all. The healer, who is himself wounded, is one of the oldest images the human imagination has produced. Think of the old stories of the physician who could cure every illness in the village except the one that lived in his own body, and who, precisely because he could never fully close his own wound, developed an uncanny, almost supernatural sensitivity to the wounds of others. He could not look away from suffering because suffering was the address he had lived at his entire life. His injury did not disqualify him from healing. It qualified him. It was his credential. This figure appears again and again in nearly every culture that has left us its stories. The shaman who was chosen not despite a period of illness or madness or exile, but because of it. The prophet who was first cast out before being permitted to see clearly. The seer whose blindness to the ordinary world was the very condition of an extraordinary inner sight. These are not decorative myths, they are maps. They are the accumulated observation, encoded in symbol because symbol survives longer than explanation, of a pattern that repeats in human development. That which nearly breaks a person, if it is faced rather than fled, becomes the very organ through which that person later perceives what others miss. So let us be precise about what actually happens psychologically on the way from scapegoat to seer, because I do not want to leave you with an inspiring image and no map for the terrain. The first stage is the wound itself, the years in the corner, however long they lasted, however they were delivered. I will not linger here longer than I already have, because you know this stage better than I could ever describe it to you. You lived it. Some of you are still living it, in echo, in the way your body still tightens when a certain tone of voice enters a room, decades later, in the way you still, even now, scan a gathering for who is upset before you have even taken off your coat. The second stage is what I would call the long freeze, the period, sometimes lasting years, sometimes lasting most of a lifetime if it is never interrupted, in which the false meaning made in childhood hardens into an entire personality. This is the stage where the wounded one becomes, functionally, a professional absorber. You get remarkably good at reading rooms. You become the friend everyone calls at midnight. You become the employee who can sense a coworker's bad day before a word is spoken. You develop what looks, from the outside, like extraordinary empathy, and it is real, it is not fake, but in this stage it is not yet a chosen gift. It is a compulsion. It is the nervous system still running the old program. Stay small, stay useful, stay attuned to everyone else's emotional weather, because your own safety once depended on it. This is empathy in service of fear. It looks generous. It often is generous to everyone except the person practicing it, who is quietly, invisibly, being drained by a role they never agreed to and have never examined. I want to be honest with you about this stage because it is the one most people mistake for arrival. A person in the long freeze often believes they have already become the sensitive, caring soul they were meant to be. They have not yet asked the harder question underneath. Am I attuned to others because I love them, or because some part of me is still standing in that corner, still trying to make the house peaceful enough that I will finally be safe? These two motivations can look identical from the outside and feel entirely different from the inside, and only the person living it can eventually tell the difference, but only after doing something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. That something is the third stage, and I will not soften it for you. It is the descent. It is the period, and every genuine transformation I have ever observed in a human being includes some version of this, in which a person stops managing the wound from a safe distance and instead turns to face it directly. This is usually not a choice made in comfort. It is usually forced by circumstance, a collapse, an illness, a divorce, a depression that will no longer be talked out of its own reality, a moment when the old strategies simply stop working and the person is left, often for the first time since childhood, without a role to perform. The corner reappears, except now there is no house around it. There is only the person and the old feeling, and no audience left to manage. This is the part of the process our culture is worst at honoring. We want the transformation without the descent. We want the seer without the dark months that produced the sight. But I have never once observed a genuine passage from wounded child to integrated adult that skipped this stage. The old material has to be met. The grief that was never allowed in that childhood house has to finally be grieved in full by the adult who is now at last strong enough and safe enough to feel it without being destroyed by it. This is agonizing work, and I will not pretend otherwise to make this speech more comfortable to deliver. But it is also the only door. Everything that is bypassed in the name of positivity, everything that is managed instead of met, remains in the basement of the personality, running the show from below, no matter how convincing the performance on the surface floors becomes. What happens for those who complete this descent? And I want to be careful with the word complete, because this work is never fully finished. It simply becomes more integrated, more livable, less compulsive over time. What happens is something I can only describe as a redistribution of power inside the personality. The old wound does not disappear. I want to be extremely clear about this because I do not wish to sell you a fantasy. The wound does not vanish, and anyone who tells you it will is selling you something. What happens instead is that the wound stops running the personality from the shadows and instead becomes one voice among many, a deeply informed voice, an experienced voice, but no longer the only voice, no longer the dictator issuing orders from the basement while the rest of the house pretends nothing is happening down there. And this is where the seer emerges, not as someone who has transcended suffering and now floats serenely above it, immune to pain, decorated with wisdom like a trophy. The seer, in the sense I mean it, is something far more useful and far less glamorous. A person whose extraordinary sensitivity, the same sensitivity that once made them a magnet for a family's unspoken shadow, has been reclaimed and repointed. Instead of scanning rooms for danger, they scan rooms for truth. Instead of absorbing others' pain because they are afraid of what happens if they don't, they perceive others' pain because they have learned to stand close to suffering without drowning in it. This is the entire difference between the empath who is compulsively, exhaustingly attuned to everyone around them, and the seer who is discerningly, sustainably attuned. The instrument is identical. The relationship to the instrument has been transformed. Let me say something about the word empath, because I think it has, in recent years, become both overused and under-examined, and I want to rescue it tonight, because underneath the overuse, there is something genuinely important. To be an empath in the deepest sense is not simply to feel things intensely, and it is certainly not to be a person who absorbs every mood in a room like a sponge with no boundary of its own. That version of empathy, the compulsive version, is not a gift. It is an old wound still doing its old job. Real empathic capacity, the kind that heals rather than depletes, the kind that can sit across from another person's grief without either fleeing it or drowning in it, requires precisely what the wounded child never had: a boundary, a self distinct enough from the pain around it to actually be present to that pain without being consumed by it. This is the paradox at the heart of tonight's whole subject, and I want to sit with it a moment because it will save some of you years of confusion. The path to becoming a true empath does not run through more sensitivity. You already have more sensitivity than you know what to do with. That was never the missing ingredient. The path runs through boundary, through selfhood, through the long unglamorous work of discovering where you end and other people's emotions begin. A discovery that was denied to you as a child when the entire family's emotional weather was treated as your responsibility, whether you agreed to it or not. So, when I say the wounded child becomes the seer, I do not mean that suffering automatically produces wisdom. History is full of people who suffered greatly and became bitter, closed, cruel, exactly because they never metabolized what happened to them. They simply carried it forward, and often without meaning to, passed it on to someone smaller and more available than themselves, exactly as it was once passed to them. Unprocessed pain does not disappear with time. It repeats generation after generation, family after family, unless someone in the chain finally stops, turns around, and does the difficult work of metabolizing what they received instead of simply transmitting it downstream. That stopping, that refusal to pass the wound along unexamined, is one of the most significant acts a human being can perform, and it is available to every single person in this room who is willing to do the harder, slower work I am describing. I think of this work the way the old alchemists thought of their craft, laboring for years over base material, convinced, against all appearances, that something as unremarkable as lead could, through a long and disciplined process nobody could rush, be transformed into gold. Modern minds are quick to dismiss this as superstition, primitive chemistry practiced by men who did not yet understand the periodic table. But I have come to believe the alchemists were describing something far more accurate about the human psyche than about metallurgy. They were describing, in the only language available to them, the process by which a person's basest material, their shame, their wound, the very thing they are most tempted to hide or destroy, becomes, through patient and repeated engagement rather than avoidance, the substance of their deepest value, not despite the wound. Through it, there is no shortcut around the base material. You cannot manufacture gold from material you refuse to touch. Let me speak for a moment about where this pattern tends to resurface in adult life, because I have watched it long enough to know it rarely announces itself honestly. It does not walk up to a person and say, I am the old family role, wearing new clothes. It disguises itself as virtue. It disguises itself as being the reliable one, the low maintenance one, the one who never causes trouble at work, even when trouble is deserved. Look at your closest relationships tonight, quietly, without judgment, and ask yourself an uncomfortable question. In how many of them are you still, unconsciously, playing the role of the household's emotional ballast, the one who calms things down, who reads the room before anyone else has to, who apologizes first to keep the peace even when the peace was never yours to keep? This is not a character flaw. It is a trained reflex, built under conditions where the alternative once felt dangerous. but a reflex built for a house you no longer live in, will, if left unexamined, keep you managing rooms that no longer require managing, protecting people who were never actually threatened, and quietly exhausting yourself in service of a safety that was only ever necessary once a long time ago, in a house with different walls. I have also noticed that this pattern shows a particular fondness for choosing partners, friends, and even employers who unconsciously recognize a familiar shape and slot the wounded one back into their old position without either party quite realizing what has happened. This is not coincidence, and it is certainly not fate. It is simply how the unconscious operates before it has been made conscious. It recreates the familiar, because the familiar, however painful, at least has the comfort of being known. A person who has never examined the original wound will often find themselves, decade after decade, in relationships that quietly require them to be the strong one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs without complaint. And they will call this compatibility, when it is, more honestly, repetition. Recognizing this is not an accusation against anyone you have loved. It is simply the beginning of choosing differently, which you cannot do until you can see the pattern clearly enough to name it while it is happening, rather than only in hindsight, years later, exhausted. There is also a particular kind of courage required here that I do not want to understate, because it is easy, from a podium, to make transformation sound like a matter of insight alone, as though seeing the pattern were the same as changing it. It is not. Seeing the pattern is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. The harder work comes afterward, in the thousand small moments where the old reflex fires and you are asked, in real time, with real stakes, to respond differently than your nervous system has been trained to respond for 30 or 40 or 50 years. It will feel, the first several times you hold a boundary, instead of collapsing into old accommodation, not like relief, but like danger. Your body will register it as a threat, because for a very long time it was one. This is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something your nervous system has never been permitted to do before. And new things, even good ones, register initially as alarm before they settle into safety. Do not mistake that alarm for proof that you have made a mistake. It is simply the sound of an old system recalibrating to a life that no longer requires the old defenses. I want to say one more thing about this stage, because it is often the loneliest part of the entire passage, and loneliness unacknowledged can quietly convince a person to turn back. As you begin to release the old role, the family peacekeeper, the office diplomat, the friend who is always available at any hour for anyone else's crisis, do not be surprised if some of the people around you resist this change more than you expected. A system that has organized itself around your self-sacrifice will often without any conscious malice, apply pressure to restore the old arrangement because your old role served a function for them, even as it depleted you. This is not proof that you should abandon the change. It is simply the friction that accompanies any real shift in a living system. Some relationships will adjust and deepen, now built on something more honest than accommodation. Others will not survive the change, and that too is not failure. It is simply evidence that they were built, in part, on a role you have outgrown rather than on the whole of who you actually are. I want to offer you something practical now, because I do not believe in leaving a room inspired and directionless. If you recognize yourself in what I have described tonight, if there is a corner somewhere in your history, a role you were assigned before you were old enough to refuse it, here is what the movement from scapegoat to seer actually asks of you, stage by stage, in plain terms. It asks you first to tell the truth about what happened, not the family's version, not the softened version you have repeated at dinner parties for 30 years to keep the peace one more time, but the actual truth, spoken at least once, even if only to yourself or to one trusted witness, a therapist, a friend, a journal at 3 in the morning. You do not owe anyone a public reckoning, but you owe yourself an honest internal one. The false meaning made in childhood, I must be the problem, cannot be dismantled by a belief you have never examined out loud. It has to be looked at directly, the way you would finally turn to look at something that has been standing behind you your whole life. It asks you, second, to grieve, actually grieve, not perform grief, not intellectualize it into an interesting story you tell at dinner parties, but feel it in your body for as long as it takes, which is longer than our culture is comfortable with, and shorter than your fear has been telling you. Grief that is finally permitted tends to move. Grief that is endlessly postponed tends to calcify into something much harder to shift. Depression, chronic anxiety, a body that keeps score long after the mind has decided to move on. It asks you, third, and this is the one people resist most, to separate the sensitivity from the fear that once organized it. Practically, this looks like learning, often for the first time in your adult life, to notice another person's distress without automatically taking responsibility for fixing it, to feel a friend's sadness without collapsing your own mood into theirs, to sit in a tense room without scanning for what you did wrong. This is not coldness. This is the boundary that makes real warmth sustainable instead of self-destructive. A seer who has no boundary burns out and calls it compassion. A seer who has built a boundary can sit with suffering for years without being consumed by it, and that endurance is precisely what makes their presence valuable to others in pain. And it asks you, finally, to choose, consciously, repeatedly, because this is not a decision made once and then finished, what you will do with the perceptiveness you were given at such cost. This is the step where the transformation becomes visible to the world, though it was always underneath, the smallest and quietest step of the four. You do not need a stage. You do not need a title. The seer is not necessarily the person standing at the front of a room. More often, it is the person at the edge of a gathering who notices the one person in the corner nobody else has spoken to yet and crosses the room toward them because they remember, in their body, not just their memory, exactly what that corner feels like. This is what I mean when I say the wound and the gift arrived in the same delivery. The very faculty that let a child sense a parent's unspoken despair from 2 rooms away, that let a child read the exact temperature of a house before opening the front door, that let a child anticipate anger before a single word was raised. That faculty, redirected, unshackled from fear, becomes one of the rarest capacities a human being can offer another. The capacity to see someone before they have found the words to be seen. Most, most people go through most of their lives only partially perceived, their real distress hovering just beneath what anyone around them notices. The one who was once a scapegoat, who has done the work of turning around and meeting what happened to them, develops an eye for exactly that hidden distress in others, not because they read a book about it, but because they lived inside it long enough to recognize its footprints anywhere. I do not say this to romanticize suffering. I want to say this plainly one more time because it matters. It would have been better if the wound had never happened. No child should be made to carry a family's unspoken shadow. If you are a parent in this room, hear this as a direct instruction, not a suggestion. Do the work of carrying your own darkness so it does not go looking for the smallest, softest person in your house to carry it for you. That is, perhaps, the most concrete and useful thing I can offer anyone here tonight who still has the chance to interrupt this pattern before it repeats one more generation. But for those of you for whom the wound is already history, already lived, already carried, in some cases already decades behind you, the question is no longer whether it should have happened. The question is what you will make of the material you were given without your consent. And here is where I want to leave you, because I think it is the truest thing I know about this whole subject. You do not have to choose between honoring the pain and building the gift. They are not opposites. The honoring is how the gift gets built. Every time you tell the truth about what happened instead of minimizing it for someone else's comfort, every time you let yourself grieve instead of performing resilience on schedule, every time you notice your own boundary and hold it, even when the old fear screams that holding it will get you abandoned. Every one of these small, private, often invisible acts is a stone laid in the long bridge between the child in the corner and the adult who can finally stand beside someone else's corner without losing themselves in it. That bridge is not built quickly. I want to be honest about that because I distrust any teacher who promises transformation on a schedule convenient to an audience. Some of you will work on this for the rest of your lives, and that is not failure. That is simply the nature of the material. But I want you to notice something before you leave this room tonight. The very fact that you are here, listening to this, recognizing yourself in a corner you have not stood in for years, recognizing a pattern in your own life that you perhaps never had language for before this evening, that recognition is not nothing. That recognition is the first stone. You cannot lay the second stone until you have laid the first, and many people go their entire lives without ever laying even that one, because looking at the corner, honestly, is the hardest part of the entire journey. So if tonight is your first stone, let it be enough for tonight. You do not have to complete the bridge by morning. You do not have to forgive anyone by morning, and you certainly do not owe anyone forgiveness on any timeline but your own. What I am asking is smaller and, I think, more honest, that you stop mistaking the wound for the whole truth of who you are. You were not only the one who was blamed, you were, underneath that role, always the one who could see what nobody else in that house was willing to see. That perceptiveness was never the problem. It was simply, for a long time, unprotected, a gift with no boundary around it, doing a job it was never meant to do. Build the boundary. Grieve what needs grieving. Tell the truth even quietly, even only to yourself at first. And then, when you are ready, not before, turn that same extraordinary attention outward again, this time by choice instead of compulsion, and use it for exactly what it was always capable of. Finding the person standing alone in the corner of whatever room you walk into next, and letting them know, without needing to say very much at all, that they have finally been seen. That is the whole of the passage. Not from broken to fixed. I do not believe in fixed, and I do not think you need fixing. From unconscious to conscious. From a wound that ran you in the dark to a wound that, faced honestly, became the very lantern by which you now help others find their own way out of theirs. You were never only the scapegoat. You were, from the very beginning, the one with the sight. It simply took the whole of this journey for you to learn how to use it on your own behalf as generously as you have always used it on behalf of everyone else. Go and do that now. The corner is empty. You may finally step out of it.